Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first Quorum Talks with Teasley for the 2020-2021 academic year. I'm Martell Teasley, Dean and Professor of the College of Social Work at the fabulous University of Utah. Welcome to our ongoing webinar series. We hope the engaging faculty presentations and CEU opportunities we're offering continue to serve you well. Since we initiated these events last spring, we've had over 3,000 registrations. We thank those of you who have attended previous events and shared the word with others about these learning opportunities with your colleagues and former classmates. We're glad for new guests and hope you are inspired to keep tuning in. We also commit to keeping these rolling in an accessible format through technology and extended recordings. We have been thrilled to engage with so many of you in recent months, and we want to keep the communication going strongly. You have taught us that this is a great way to do things, so thank you. As I've said before, these Quorum Talks with Teasley webinars showcase the many talents of our College of Social Work faculty and staff and the critical challenges and discuss many of the critical challenges facing us today. Some of these challenges have been with us for generations, of course, and deserve special attention. First, the College of Social Work acknowledges the land of the University of Utah occupies has always been indigenous land. We recognize the rich history of our Native American brothers and sisters, and we are deeply grateful that the indigenous folk of Utah preserve and protect this land for future generations. The College of Social Work remains committed to supporting equity and diversity among our students, faculty, and staff in our communication, our curriculum, and our community engagement. This message is particularly meaningful in connection with today's Quorum Talks with Teasley, titled Creating More Equitable Public Schools. I'm honored to introduce our speaker, College of Social Work Assistant Professor Tasha Seneca Keyes. Dr. Keyes earned her MSW with us in 1994 and went on to earn her PhD at the University of Chicago Social Service Administration, School of Social Service Administration in 2017. Between her time as a student and as a faculty member, Dr. Keyes has been with the college for over 7 years. Her research focuses on working with Native American communities to better understand the barriers to their belongingness in schools and how social workers can break down these barriers. She became interested in this area of research after spending time as a school social worker and realized how a sense of belonging is to the learning process. Dr. Keyes understands that Native students make up a small percentage of the U.S. public school student body and so often they go unnoticed. She is passionate in her efforts to help these students work and highlight their work so that they can do more. We hope you enjoyed Dr. Keyes' presentation and that you will continue to join us for our Quorum Talks with Teasley and our Grand Challenges on Social Work series. Our next Quorum events will feature Dr. Kristen Saver on October 20th. Her presentation will be Confronting Reentry Challenges, Supporting Reintegration After Release from Prison. And on November 18th, we will have Dr. Adam Hantley. His presentation is titled, Is Self-Interest Really in Your Best Interest? Exploring the Benefits of Self-Transcendent Experiences. On October 15th, in our Grand Challenges series, we will feature John Prafford discussing the true cause of mass incarceration and how to achieve real reform. Spring term events will be announced in coming months. We hope these webinar series serve you well. We know social workers are essential workers, and we want to do our part to prepare a new generation of social workers, as well as support the pillars of the profession. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Tasha Seneca Keyes. Dr. Keyes, thank you for leading us today. The floor is yours. Take care, my friends.
Thank you, Dean Teasley. I appreciate it. And I'm so grateful to be here to share some of my research with you, with everyone. I am going to just share my screen with everybody so we can, you all can see my PowerPoint and we can proceed that way. So again, thank you for everyone that's joining us today. And thank you for the introduction, Dean Teasley. I have prepared, it's about a 35-minute presentation today, and I'd like to have some questions and answers at the end. But similarly, as Dean Teasley did, I would also like to take a moment and acknowledge that I'm in Salt Lake City, Utah, and that this land has always belonged to Indigenous people, specifically the Shoshone, the Paiute, the Goshute, and the Ute Native tribes. The erasure of this relationship between Native peoples and their traditional lands is an insidious form of ongoing settler colonialism, and we must be mindful of its continuing impact and work to mitigate it. I also want to recognize and honor the deep history of these sovereign nations, as well as the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. As a Native woman, as a social work scholar, and a former school social worker, I am obligated to my ancestors, the past and future Indigenous communities, and I feel accountable to the hopes and needs of Native people. The National Congress of American Indians has stated that quality education is a central component of the federal government's trust responsibility to tribes, and this commitment must be upheld. Due to this relationship that Native people have in this country, my research and my practice interests relate to finding ways to improve the educational outcome of Native students. As Barbara Jordan, the American lawyer, educator, and civil rights leader once said, education remains the key to both economic and political empowerment. So because of this, American Indian students occupy a unique place in US history. This is in relationship to past policies of assimilation that removed a generation of American Indian children from their families, as well as the loss of land, loss of tradition, culture, and language. For many Native students, families, and communities, the devastating consequences of these effects are long-lasting. However, it's also incredibly important to highlight that in face of these devastating effects, our persistence to survive remains strong. So to give you some context, there are approximately 644,000 American Indian Alaska Native students in the United States K-12 public education system. This represents about 1.2% of public school students nationally. So 90% of Native students attend public schools, while 8% attend schools either administered by the Bureau of Indian Education, also known as the BIE, or by individual tribes. Although American Indian and Alaska Native students are more likely to attend rural schools than their non-Native peers, a majority of Native students live off reservations, and an increasing number attend schools in urban areas. Approximately a third of Native students attend schools where 50% or more of the student body is American Indian. 3 out of every 10 Native students drop out. This is a dropout rate that is twice the national average. So Native students' academic achievement and educational attainment lags far behind that of their white peers. Nationwide, Native students face some of the lowest high school graduation rates and even fewer enroll in and graduate from college. In 2016, 17% of American Indian students continued their education after high school, compared to 60% of the US population. Nationally, Asian and white students have been overrepresented in gifted education since 1978, whereas students from other racial and ethnic backgrounds, such as Native Americans, Latinx, and African American groups have been underrepresented. There have been gradual increases in this underrepresented since 1994. So some context also. So here in Utah, from 2002 to 2006, the representation of American Indian and Latinx students in gifted programs has increased. So yay, Utah, for that progress that we're making. However, problems still exist for African American students because their representation in gifted programs has actually decreased during that time here in Utah. So we still have work to do. Historically, disciplinary practices employed in US public schools punished, excluded, and socially controlled students while doing little to meet their basic needs. Zero tolerance policies punish both major and minor infractions uniformly and harshly, which in turn has disproportionately impacted students of color and students with disabilities and caused researchers to examine its harmful effects. School suspension is one of the most widely used disciplinary responses, yet we know it's ineffective in promoting pro-social behaviors based on the research that's been completed. Researchers report that these disciplinary practices often results in students' defiance, decreased sense of belonging, and a diminished capacity to engage in the school community. Since 1970s, the school suspensions have tripled. An out-of-school suspension is an instance where a student is temporarily removed from his or her regular school day for disciplinary purpose for at least half the day, possibly to another setting such as home or even a behavior center. So some statistics is that in 2013 to 2014, about 2.6 million public school students, which is a little over 5%, received one or more out-of-school suspension. And when it's broken down by race, here's what we see. We see that a higher percentage of Black students, a little less than 14%, are represented in out-of-school suspension. This is followed by a little under 7% of American Indian Alaska Native students. Roughly 5% of students are two or more races. And then we have 5.5% which are represented in these numbers, which are Hispanic and also Pacific Island students. 3.4% of white students, and then 1.1% of Asian students. More than twice as many male students, around 7.3%, than female students, a little more than 3%, received one or more out-of-school suspensions in 2013-14. This pattern of high percentages of male than female students receiving out-of-school suspensions was observed for all racial and ethnic groups. About 111,000 students were also expelled from school in 2013-14. The percentages of Black and American Indian students who were expelled were higher than any other percentages for students in all other racial and ethnic groups. So the question then begins, what do we do? How do we start mitigating and eradicating some of these disproportionate numbers in suspension and expulsion? So educators, researchers, and policymakers are attempting to address these disparities by embracing restorative justice practices and approaches, which have traditionally been reserved for juvenile and criminal justice settings. So what is restorative justice? Restorative practices and philosophies have grown out of indigenous ways of being in the world. Some Native and indigenous people and communities believe that conflict is a natural and inevitable aspect of our human existence. Conflict and harm is considered a natural and important part of community. And through this process, the aim is to restore relationships, make amends, and/or make restitution for harms and wrongdoings to others. All of this so that healing can occur. Research shows that using restorative justice approaches in schools is a viable strategy to changing the school culture from one of social control to one of social engagement. Because restorative justice is student-centered, it can lead to more equitable academic and social emotional outcomes, especially for students of color and students with special needs. The primary goal of restorative justice is to bring healing when conflict and harm arise by building and maintaining relationships within the school community. When restorative justice practices include cultural components, they promote positive communication skills, create a healing space for students, and support others in healing from traumatic events. Culturally relevant restorative justice practices can also create a sense of community and belonging that facilitates affirmation and resilience. The restorative approach to discipline allows individual students, teachers, administrators, and the school community to understand conflict, harm, and failure. When restorative justice is used, the conflict is seen as opportunities for deeper learning about the consequences of one's choices and the impact of one's choices on others in the school community and beyond. When used, it promotes a positive school community. So restorative justice is not just a practice, it's actually a philosophical approach. It's not just a skill that can be pulled out of our educator's toolbox. It is an approach that needs to be practiced by all members of the school community. Restorative justice permeates, again, all aspects of the school community and all relationships. So this means student to student, teacher to student, teacher to teacher, administrator to teacher, and administrator to students. And implementing restorative justice is challenging. It can be challenging, particularly because it's a philosophy that takes time to implement because it requires all adults in the buildings to not only support one another, but also to work on themselves. When restorative justice is embraced school-wide as a philosophy, social, emotional, and behavioral learning can occur, while also holding educators and students to high expectations while providing opportunities to reflect on their interactions with others and themselves, and to develop critical social, emotional, and non-cognitive skills that help them to navigate their peer group, their interactions with adults, and the community outside of the school. So again, restorative justice really allows everyone within the school to pause, to reflect, and to find ways to constructively communicate with one another. And this results in safer schools. So to achieve these outcomes, school administrators and personnel must also use culturally responsive strategies to their approach to school discipline and have it be tailored to the racial and cultural representation and the needs of their school community. Restorative justice is not just a disciplinary tool to manage behavior, but it should also be used as a tool for student learning. So I have the honor to be working closely with a rural school district. They're in their 4th year of implementing restorative justice across their school district. And I want to share some of their successes. So San Juan County is a rural community located in the southeastern part of Utah. It has a population of a little more than 15,000 people. And a small part of the Navajo Nation, which is the largest American Indian jurisdiction within the United States, is located in San Juan County. San Juan is the only minority-majority county in Utah, with 56.5% of the total population reporting a race or ethnicity other than white, non-Hispanic. So in October 2017, the Utah State Board of Education reported that the state serves 6,754 American Indian and Alaskan Native students. This is 1% of the student body statewide. In San Juan School District, the total K-12 enrollment is 2,889, and it serves 1,562 American Indian students. This makes up 54% of their student body. In 2015, a University of Utah Law School report showed that the discipline disparities in San Juan School District are drastic. It showed that 22.5% of all American Indian students have been given a disciplinary action compared to 4.2% of white students. To address these disparities, San Juan School District applied for federal funds from Indian Education and hired 6 school social workers. These 6 school social workers have received explicit restorative justice education and training, all funded through their grant funds. And as a result, they have become leaders in their schools and their communities. They are effectively implementing restorative justice practices in their schools while also providing options for students who have disciplinary issues with the goal of keeping them in school, and also providing the opportunity that if they choose, they can use their traditional Navajo peacemaking as a way to resolve the disciplinary action. It's also important to know that the peacemaking program is part of the judicial branch of the Navajo Nation. Peacemaking is a voluntary, value-driven process of mediation and conferencing to bring healing and understanding to the victim and the offender. In several of San Juan schools, where they have majority Native student enrollment, they have built Navajo hogans located on the school grounds in order to hold the peacemaking circles. This cultural addition to the school's restorative justice approach has been welcomed for Native students, particularly those who are more traditional in their Navajo cultural practices. But not all Native students participate in the Hogan peacemaking circles. But more importantly, it sends the message to the school community that their Native beliefs and practices are valued and an important way of life. So San Juan School District, they're in their 4th year of their grant. So some of the statistics that we have currently is taken from the 2017-18 school year. And in this school year, San Juan School District reports that this project served 1,769 American Indian students. And as a result of the restorative justice practices, San Juan School District has improved their performance measures. So they've seen a significant increase in the average ACT composite score. It went from 13.85 to 16.28 overall. And part of what is contributing to this is their grant funds have provided money to allow students to take the ACT a second time. For many of these students in the school district, they were not able to take an ACT a second time because they didn't have the funds. So they were able to provide funding for 67 students to take the ACT a second time, thus improving their ACT composite score. San Juan School District has also seen a 9% increase in attendance rate through the school district. So students who are identified at risk due to absenteeism went from 496 students during their baseline year to 441 students during the first year of the program. Something to also know about these students that attend San Juan schools is many of the native students who live on the Navajo Nation must ride their bus 2 hours each way on dirt roads. And so you can see a lot of times, especially when the weather gets bad, how difficult it may be to attend school on a regular basis. And so these funds and the restorative justice and promoting sense of belonging are ways that restorative justice are helping to have these students come to school each day. There's also been a significant decrease that shows 78% decrease in suspensions and expulsions across the district during their first year of implementation. So when we're looking at these statistics, you should also know that even though these statistics and these outcomes are impressive, and based on the restorative justice literature, they're actually expected outcomes. They're expected to make these improvements using restorative justice. One area, however, that the restorative justice literature has not fully explored is how restorative justice promotes belonging and builds positive school relationships. So I am currently in the middle of a study that asks that question about how restorative justice promotes positive school relationships. So to tell you a little bit about my study, at this point, I have completed over 32 interviews of principals, assistant principals, school social workers, students, and parents in San Juan School District to understand if having school social workers in their schools implementing culturally relevant restorative justice improves their sense of belonging and fosters positive school-based relationships. My research team and I have not yet finished the analysis of this study, but the preliminary results are showing us that when restorative justice is implemented school-wide, when it has strong leadership from both the principal and the assistant principal, which is also supported by school social workers and teachers, that it can affect school-based relationships in a positive way. Research has shown that an important function of education and schooling is to have meaningful relationships and attachments. Positive school-based relationships actually operate as a motivating factor to productively impact student engagement. So once my analysis is complete, I hope to report my findings to you about that. So earlier in my talk, I outlined the discipline disparities in K-12 schools specific to American Indian students. And I also talked to you about the traditional approach for dealing with discipline in our schools. And to highlight that again, the traditional approach has largely been exclusionary, punitive, and shameful in nature. In contrast, restorative justice embraces the values of dignity, mutual concern, and respect. These values closely align with social work's core values outlined by NASW, which comprise of social justice, dignity and worth of the individual, and centrality of human relationships. Similarly, the skills necessary to implement restorative justice approaches include conflict resolution, group work, and community building. These skills are compatible with our social work training. Therefore, drawing upon the skills of social workers and our interests to implement restorative practices in schools, it actually could be a game changer in reducing racial disparities in our public education system. According to the School Social Work Association of America, school social workers hold these core social work values while focusing their efforts to promote a school climate and culture that is conducive to learning and teaching excellence by promoting effective school discipline policies and administrative procedures. They are charged with enhancing the professional capacity of school personnel and facilitating engagement between student, family, school, and community. In a 2011 Umbret and Amore seminal book titled Restorative Justice Dialogue, an Essential Guide for Research and Practice, they center social work within the restorative justice movement, where they dedicate an entire chapter to the intersection of restorative justice and social work. While this book was situated in the criminal and juvenile justice fields, it clearly articulates the ways in which social work core values are aligned with the core principles of restorative justice, and considers the multiple ways that these complementary values and principles can be moved into practice. They highlight the mutually beneficial pairing of the fields in this following quote. Social work's focus on cultural sensitivity and the strengths empowerment approach can help restorative justice become more aware of the need for developing culturally specific approaches. In return, restorative justice offers an avenue for social work to reclaim part of its place and its early birthright in criminal justice by providing competencies for principled practice in corrections and other systems that deal with harm and wrongdoing. These scholars have demonstrated the connection between social work and restorative justice. They have challenged both fields to resist practicing in isolation. Yet an informal review of social work education program reveals few references to restorative justice inclusion in our curriculum. So this leads me to share with you a study about this integration. So based on this clear link between restorative justice and social work, my colleagues, Drs. Jen Molloy, Michael Riquino, and I, along with the invaluable support of research assistant Hannah Wahlart, conducted an integrative review with the foundational assumption that restorative justice and the social work profession have mutually beneficial and overlapping values, principles, and interests. The aim of this integrative review was to determine how social work and restorative have been integrated over time and in what settings. So just to give you a little background on how we conducted this, we ended up searching the EBSCO host databases between February 1997 to February 2019, using the search terms restorative justice and social work. We only included results where both terms were present in the abstract. This criterion was included based on the assumption that if social work and restorative justice were meaningfully covered in the article, both would be mentioned in the abstract. This resulted in 172 search results and a total of 54 articles after duplicates were removed. We reviewed titles and abstracts to determine if articles related to the research question, how are restorative justice and social work integrated in the literature? As part of our process and in order to strengthen the reliability, the authors reviewed all 54 articles and abstracts, 11 book reviews, and 2 additional duplicates were excluded. During this phase, we held regular meetings to review exclusion and inclusion criteria and to discuss articles that we wanted to include and ones that we were uncertain. So ultimately, after our big search, our process of inclusion and exclusion yielded 27 articles. We utilized content analysis to summarize the finding of the articles into themes. And to develop these thematic categories, we each independently reviewed article abstract, noted overarching themes related to the ways in which restorative justice and social work were integrated. And then we narrowed the themes to the following major categories: practice, conceptual, and education. So as you can see, the 16 practice articles we identified seek to develop social work practice and interventions based on restorative justice theory. So we found that this supported our assumption that restorative justice and social work have mutually beneficial and overlapping values. The practice setting in our review included community, child welfare, and the justice system, with the majority pertaining to juvenile and criminal justice settings. There is ample research published by other disciplines that attest to the benefits of including restorative justice approaches in traditional social work settings, which include schools, juvenile and criminal justice, child welfare, and interpersonal violence. Given that social work researchers have not been at the forefront of this research, the role of social workers in these settings has not been adequately outlined. For restorative justice to be further embedded in social work settings, existing practice knowledge needs to be expanded and shared generously. This is especially apparent in K-12 education, where restorative justice is being implemented at increasing rates, and it's been identified as a promising approach to eliminating disproportionality in school suspension and expulsion practices and building positive school culture and climate. The conceptual articles identified in this review seek to further develop the integration of restorative justice and social work theories. However, since 2009, there's been limited growth in the body of literature that develops the mutually reinforcing ways that restorative justice and social work can be conceptually integrated. Despite this, there's been a growth in social work scholars' attention to use restorative justice to use inequities in the prison systems. We anticipate this continued development in this area as incidences of police brutality continue to plague the US, and calls for defunding or abolishing law enforcement are heard. As new models of addressing conflict, crime, and harm are considered, the field of restorative justice offers decades of practice and research to contribute to this reimagining. Including restorative justice in social work research, education, and practice is critical at this time to support efforts to end discrimination and injustice associated with the harms created by policing, incarceration, and criminalization, which disproportionately impacts communities of color. One article emerged from our review that fell into the education theme, which addresses the relevance of restorative justice to social work education, training, and curriculum. In 2006, social work scholar Catherine Van Wormer outlines the numerous ways that restorative justice is relevant to social work values and education, including concern for the whole person and anti-oppressive practices. She recommends strategies for enhancing restorative justice education in social work education to include promoting restorative justice in the criminal justice system as a way to reduce negative attitudes about this area of practice. We can also be assigning students to field placements in settings using restorative justice. And lastly, we can use examples of restorative justice evaluation research in our research courses and research on social policy with a restorative lens. Van Wormer notes, social work practice and elective courses may provide a space for reviewing restorative justice as both a theory and a practice. In 2006, Van Wormer predicted that restorative justice processes would gain more attention in social work circles because of its relevance to social work values, its effectiveness at meeting the needs of victims, offenders, and the community, and the coverage by the media and relevance to the social work profession's ongoing search for innovative remedies for social problems. However, disappointingly, now in 2020, As my colleagues and I are working to publish this study of our integrative review, we fear that the social work profession trails behind in promoting and integrating restorative justice practices in transforming violence and conflict and building just and caring communities and supporting a movement to redefine the purpose of justice. As national conversations of incidences of gender and race-based bias, mass incarceration, the Me Too movement, these have all brought restorative justice to public consciousness. And so we feel the time is right to further this conversation about the role social workers can play in this promising movement. Raising awareness in students and facilitating the development of restorative practice skills will prepare social workers to contribute on the micro level with repairing harm and transforming conflict between individuals, as well as the meso and macro areas of policy innovation, program development, and community organizing. In a 2017 article written by R. Dean Teasley and Associates, they state that social workers have an instrumental role to play in facilitating interdisciplinary collaboration, political advocacy at the local, regional, and national levels, and capacity building for those seeking to implement restorative justice. Social work scholars and practitioners need to contribute to the research that integrates restorative justice theory and social work theories that are being promoted as best practices in non-justice settings, particularly in K-12 settings, trauma-informed care, social emotional learning, and culturally responsive practices. So this brings me to my last slide. And to note with excitement the ways the Utah legislature, Utah Public Schools, and the College of Social Work at the University of Utah are working together to change educational disparities in our state. Last year, the Utah legislature approved House Bill 373, allocating $32 million to hire more school social workers, school counselors, mental health professionals, and nurses. Simultaneously, the College of Social Work was hard at work developing a school social work career path that includes 2 social work courses that integrates concepts and theories using restorative justice approaches and also working in rural and Native communities. We are all well aware here at the College of Social Work that our students, particularly the ones enrolled in school social work career path, play a vital role in facilitating and implementing restorative justice in schools. And overall, school social workers need more explicit restorative justice training and education. We are finding ways to better prepare our social work students to effectively work in schools using a restorative justice approach. So I share this example not only to toot our horn, but to also highlight how when we work together across sectors, disciplines, professions, and cultures, we can find ways to reduce these educational disparities and improve the life outcomes for all students. So I want to thank you all for attending and your interest in this topic. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I think we'll have some time for question and answers. So let's see. One of the questions from one of our attendees asked, do I believe if trauma-informed classrooms are or should be a part of restorative justice? I think that's a great question, and I would actually like to share that restorative justice and trauma-informed classrooms or trauma-informed care really nicely overlap with one another. Part of the work that I'm doing in the study that I'm doing down in San Juan County is actually to examine how their practices align with the trauma-informed literature. And so I do believe restorative justice is one way to be trauma-informed. There are multiple ways, But yes, I do believe that we should have trauma-informed classrooms, and restorative justice does need to be a part of that as well. Great question. So the next question is restorative justice and restorative practices the same in the database lit review? They're actually not. Restorative justice, so there's a difference between a philosophy, practices, and approaches. They're used sometimes very interchangeably, but the philosophy, when you think of a restorative justice philosophy, that actually is when it becomes school-wide, or it is embedded in the culture and climate within the school. Restorative practices sometimes can mean one-offs, or it can be just skill building. And so although restorative practices are helpful, if you don't have the philosophical or foundational belief system within the school or within any organization that you're working, the restorative practices actually end up being just kind of add-on or tools that you end up pulling out. And so they actually are slightly different. They're both important, but depending on the objective that you're trying to achieve, they can be used differently. Thanks for that question. Let's see, I've got another question. Let's see, the question asks, if parents are unsupportive or uninvolved with their children, especially when it comes to their education, how do you suggest we use restorative justice to include them in working with their students? We can only do so much in a classroom, but what about the home life? There could also be improvements in family dynamics and home life. What do you suggest? I think that's a great question, and I have to be completely honest. Taking restorative justice out of the school and implementing it in the home is not something that I'm super familiar with. But you know, my thought is, when you think about what the restorative justice philosophy is, it's to repair harm. When conflicts arise, how can we repair harm? And a lot of times these end up being talking circles, peacemaking circles, where conferencing can happen for families to be able to resolve the conflict. And so the reality is that these could be used in family conferences. The only thing that I would recommend, that as social workers, if you were going to be the person to be the mediator of this family conference, it would be super, super important that you get the necessary training to be able to be the mediator of this family conference. But they can definitely be used with families. They have been used in juvenile justice settings. And so I would encourage you to look a little bit more around how you could use them in families. Let's see, and then I've got a question around, how would current school social workers and administrators get trained in restorative justice and how to implement it in their schools? That's a great question. And I think that we need to figure out ways to get better training for our social workers based on our integrative review. There are not many educational programs across the country that are actually training social workers in their schools. Would definitely be something that we need to begin looking towards. We are starting that with the school social work career path, and where we will be discussing restorative justice. We won't get into how to implement it in their schools, but they'll be given many resources around where they can go to get training and also to learn better how to implement it. Let's see what else. This is a good question. I've been asked is, and it relates to the first one around how do we use restorative justice with families, particularly around parents who are not involved. And if I'm seeing parents of students getting involved in San Juan County. At this point, it's hard to say because we haven't finished our analysis, the impact that parents getting involved in their schooling. You know, the question is how do we get parents more involved? And that continues to be an age-long question around family engagement. This is something that we are teaching our school social workers that are enrolled in the school social work career path around ways to engage families and get them involved. Restorative justice could be a way to do that, depending on what the issues are for the family and the reasons why they're not involved much. And so I think depending on what those issues are, some of the barriers that are involved in parents and families getting more involved in schools, finding those out is something that we're actually teaching our school social workers to begin to dig into how they can begin eradicating some of these barriers that are in the place of parents and families getting involved with school. And so our hope is that with this career path, with restorative justice, that we can begin looking at and seeing how to get more parents involved in schools and working towards that end. Let's see, I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions. Let's see. Oh, someone's just said she works in the juvenile court system with a new and growing restorative justice program. While some are eager to engage in this process, there are others who are very reluctant, skeptical, and drawn to their more traditionally punitive approach. What practical ideas do you have for educating and engaging those who may be more reluctant to participate? That is an excellent question, and it's something, as I have been down in San Juan County, that I've actually come across in talking to administrators around implementing restorative justice in their schools and with school social workers down there as well. Basically, what they have told me is exactly what you're indicating here is because they're so embedded and they're reluctant in being traditionally punitive, that it really takes a paradigm shift to see that the compassion, the dignity, and the value placed in human beings to resolve conflict is really difficult. It's difficult for many educators, and it sounds like you're seeing the same thing in the juvenile court system. One of the ways to kind of begin shifting this mindset is to be able to document and to be able to show those who are reluctant or skeptical to using this, start showing them the results of those who are implementing these restorative practices. I know when I was talking to some school social workers down in San Juan County, they would often tell me that many teachers really struggled with what they termed when there was conferencing around a conflict, the teachers ended up terming, oh, you're just letting this student off the hook. And when in fact, they were actually trying to get to the root cause of the problem and why this student was either acting out or misbehaving or having other disciplinary issues. And so as a result of this, it wasn't until they were able to actually see the results and the outcomes. One of the stories that I would like to share with you is that an assistant principal shared with me when I interviewed him. He told me about how there was one student in his school that got in trouble with a teacher. The teacher accused him of cheating on a test, and the student said, no, I did not cheat. But there was no way around it. And the assistant principal was actually the one who had to be the mediator between the teacher and the student. The assistant principal went and talked to the parent of this student and basically said, you know, I don't know which way is right. I don't know if what the teacher is telling me, she's very convinced that this student cheated, and the student is telling me, no, he did not. And he says, I don't have any way of knowing for sure, you know, which one is right. And so he talked to the parent and basically said, you know, I need to do something, but because I don't know what is the truth, I need to look at this in a way that what we are ultimately doing is not saying you're right and you're wrong, is we need to repair the relationship. Whatever happened, happened, but the relationship between the student and the teacher has been harmed. And so in order to repair that relationship, the assistant principal decided that what he was going to do is he was going to have this student who actually excelled in this class to go and work with another student who was struggling in the same class. His thinking, the assistant principal's thinking behind this was that by helping out another student in this teacher's class, that he would then begin to repair harm that was created between him and the teacher. The mom thought this was a great idea. The teacher thought this was a great idea. The student, I'm not really sure if he thought it was a great idea, but he was up for it anyways. And so that was one of the ways that they ended up addressing that issue. The student and the teacher developed a stronger relationship, and it actually promoted his sense of belonging as well as the teacher's sense of belonging for the two of them in the same classroom. And so that's one of the success stories that occurred when this assistant principal, who was able to take a situation where the teacher was very, very angry. She wanted him to be suspended, expelled, failed the class, all of these very punitive measures. But the assistant principal was able to take, pause, reflect on it, take a step back, and figure out a way that these two could actually heal their relationship and move forward. And so that's just one example, but I think in having those types of examples and having those who are reluctant to be able to see in real time how the impact the restorative justice has within the system is the way that we start changing paradigms and thoughts, mindsets around being punitive versus restorative justice in nature. And so thank you for that question. Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. I'm just looking at the time now, and I think we are all out of questions, and I think we're getting close to the end of time. So I think I'll pass it back over to Emily.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Seneca Keyes, for your wonderful presentation and all of your expertise with these questions. It's so great to have all of our viewers here listening to everything you have to say. We hope that our viewers will continue coming to our events. As Dean Teasley said, we have another Grand Challenges event next month, along with 2 more Core and Talks with Teasley events coming up in this fall semester. Which you can learn about on our events page. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And other than that, thank you again so much, Dr. Seneca Keyes, and we hope you all have a great afternoon.